Chapter 7. Why man is destitute of natural weapons and covering. But what means the uprightness of his figure, and why is it that those powers which aid life do not naturally belong to his body? But man is brought into life bare of natural covering, an unarmed and poor being, destitute of all things useful, worthy according to appearances of pity rather than of admiration, not armed with prominent horns or sharp claws, nor with hooves nor with teeth, nor possessing by nature any deadly venom and a sting, things such as most animals have in their own power for defense against those who do them harm. His body is not protected with a covering of hair, and yet possibly it was to be expected that he who was promoted to rule over the rest of the creatures should be defended by nature with arms of his own, so that he might not need assistance from others for his own security. Now, however, the lion, the boar, the tiger, the leopard, and all the like have natural power sufficient for their safety, and the bull has his horn, the hare his speed, the deer his leap, and the certainty of his sight, and another beast has bulk, others a proboscis, the birds have their wings, and the bee her sting, and generally in all there is some protective power implanted by nature. But man alone of all is slower than the beasts that are swift of foot, smaller than those that are of great bulk, more defenseless than those that are protected by natural arms. And how, one will say, has such a being obtained the sovereignty over all things? Well, I think that it would not be at all hard to show that what seems to be a deficiency of our nature is a means for our obtaining dominion over the subject creatures. For if man had had such power as to be able to outrun the horse in swiftness, and to have a foot that from its solidity could not be worn out, but was strengthened by hoofs or claws of some kind, and to carry upon him horns and stings and claws, he would be, to begin with, a wild-looking and formidable creature, if such things grew with his body, and moreover he would have neglected his rule over the other creatures if he had no need of the cooperation of his subjects. Whereas now the needful services of our life are divided among the individual animals that are under our sway, for this reason, to make our dominion over them necessary. It was the slowness and difficult motion of our body that brought the horse to supply our need and tamed him. It was the nakedness of our body that made necessary our management of sheep, which supplies the deficiency of our nature by its yearly produce of wool. It was the fact that we import from others the supplies for our living, which subjected beasts of burden to such service. Furthermore, it was the fact that we cannot eat grass like cattle, which brought the ox to render service to our life, who makes our living easy for us by his own labor. And because we needed teeth and biting power to subdue some of the other animals, by grip of teeth, the dog gave together with his swiftness his own jaw to supply our need, becoming like a live sword for man. And there has been discovered by men iron stronger and more penetrating than prominent horns or sharp claws, not as those things do with the beasts, always growing naturally with us, but entering into alliance with us for the time, and for the rest abiding by itself. And to compensate for the crocodile's scaly hide, one may make that very hide serve as armor, by putting it on his skin upon occasion, or failing that, art fashions iron for this purpose too, which when it has served him for a time for war, leaves the man at arms once more free from the burden in time of peace. And the wing of the birds too ministers to our life, so that by aid of contrivance we are not left behind even by the speed of wings. For some of them become tame and are of service to those who catch birds, and by their means others are by contrivance subdued to serve our needs. Moreover, art contrives to make our arrows feathered, and by means of the bow gives us for our needs the speed of wings. Well, the fact that our feet are easily hurt and worn in traveling makes necessary the aid which is given by the subject animals. For hence it comes that we fit shoes to our feet. Chapter 8. Why man's form is upright, and that hands were given him because of reason, wherein also is a speculation on the difference of souls. But man's form is upright, and extends aloft towards heaven, and looks upwards, and these are marks of sovereignty which show his royal dignity. For the fact that man alone among existing things is such as this, while all others bow their bodies downwards, clearly points to the difference of dignity between those which stoop beneath his sway and that power which rises above them. For all the rest have the foremost limbs of their bodies in the form of feet, because that which stoops needs something to support it. But in the formation of man these limbs were made hands, for the upright body found one base, supporting its position securely on 2 feet, sufficient for its needs. Especially do these ministering hands adapt themselves to the requirements of the reason. Indeed, if one were to say that the ministration of hands is a special property of the rational nature, he would not be entirely wrong. And that not only because his thought turns to the common and obvious fact that we signify our reasoning by means of the natural employment of our hands in written characters. It is true that this fact, that we speak by writing, and in a certain way converse by the aid of our hands, preserving sounds by the forms of the alphabet, is not unconnected with the endowment of reason. But I am referring to something else when I say that the hands cooperate with the bidding of reason. Let us, however, before discussing this point, consider the matter we passed over, for the subject of the order of created things almost escaped our notice. Why the growth of things that spring from the earth takes precedence, and the irrational animals come next. And then, after the making of these, comes man. For it may be that we learn from these facts not only the obvious thought that grass appeared to the Creator useful for the sake of the animals, while the animals were made because of man, and that for this reason, before the animals there was made their food, and before man that which was to minister to human life. But it seems to me that by these facts Moses reveals a hidden doctrine, and secretly delivers that wisdom concerning the soul, of which the learning that is without had indeed some imagination, but no clear comprehension. His discourse, then, hereby teaches us that the power of life and soul may be considered in three divisions. For one is only a power of growth and nutrition, supplying what is suitable for the support of the bodies that are nourished, which is called the vegetative soul, and is to be seen in plants, for we may perceive in growing plants a certain vital power destitute of sense. And there is another form of life besides this, which, while it includes the form above mentioned, is also possessed in addition of the power of management according to sense, and this is to be found in the nature of the irrational animals. For they are not only the subjects of nourishment and growth, but also have the activity of sense and perception. But perfect bodily life is seen in the rational, the human nature, which both is nourished and endowed with sense, and also partakes of reason and is ordered by the mind. We might make a division of our subject in some such way as this: of things existing, part are intellectual, part corporeal. Let us leave alone for the present the division of the intellectual according to its properties, for our argument is not concerned with these. Of the corporeal, part is entirely devoid of life, and part shares in vital energy. Of a living body, again, part has sense conjoined with life, and part is without sense. Lastly, that which has sense is again divided into rational and irrational. For this reason the lawgiver says that after inanimate matter, as a sort of foundation for the form of animate things, this vegetative life was made, and had earlier existence in the growth of plants. Then he proceeds to introduce the genesis of those creatures which are regulated by sense, and since following the same order of those things which have obtained life in the flesh, those which have sense can exist by themselves even apart from the intellectual nature, while the rational principle could not be embodied save as blended with the sensitive. For this reason man was made last after the animals, as nature advanced in an orderly course to perfection. For this rational animal, man, is blended of every form of soul. He is nourished by the vegetative kind of soul, and to the faculty of growth was added that of sense, which stands midway. If we regard its peculiar nature between the intellectual and the more material essence being as much coarser than the one, as it is more refined than the other, then takes place a certain alliance and commixture of the intellectual essence with the subtle and enlightened element of the sensitive nature, so that man consists of these three, as we are taught the like thing by the Apostle in what he says to the Ephesians, praying for them that the complete grace of their body and soul and spirit may be preserved at the coming of the Lord, using the word body for the nutritive part, and denoting the sensitive by the word soul, and the intellectual by spirit. Likewise, too, the Lord instructs the scribe in the gospel that he should set before every commandment that love to God, which is exercised with all the heart and soul and mind. For here also it seems to me that the phrase indicates the same difference, naming the more corporeal existence, heart, the intermediate, soul, and the higher nature, the intellectual and mental faculty, mind. Hence also the apostle recognizes three divisions of dispositions, calling one carnal, which is busied with the belly and the pleasures connected with it, another natural, which holds a middle position with regard to virtue and vice, rising above the one but without pure participation in the other, and another spiritual, which perceives the perfection of godly life. Wherefore he says to the Corinthians, reproaching their indulgence in pleasure and passion, "Ye are carnal, and incapable of receiving the more perfect doctrine." While elsewhere, making a comparison of the middle kind with the perfect, he says, "But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit, for they are foolishness unto him. But he that is spiritual judgeth all things, yet he himself is judged of no man. As then the natural man is higher than the carnal, by the same measure also the spiritual man rises above the natural." If, therefore, Scripture tells us that man was made last after every animate thing, the lawgiver is doing nothing else than declaring to us the doctrine of the soul, considering that what is perfect comes last, according to a certain necessary sequence in the order of things. For in the rational are included the others also, while in the sensitive there also surely exists the vegetative form, and that again is conceived only in connection with what is material. Thus we may suppose that nature makes an ascent, as it were by steps, the various properties of life, from the lower to the perfect form. Now, since man is a rational animal, the instrument of his body must be made suitable for the use of reason, as you may see musicians producing their music according to the form of their instruments, and not piping with harps nor harping upon flutes. So it must needs be that the organization of these instruments of ours should be adapted for reason, that when struck by the vocal organs it might be able to sound properly for the use of words. For this reason the hands were attached to the body, for though we can count up very many uses in daily life for which these skillfully contrived and helpful instruments, our hands, that easily follow every art and every operation, alike in war and in peace, are serviceable, yet nature added them to our body preeminently for the sake of reason. For if man were destitute of hands, the various parts of his face would certainly have been arranged like those of the quadrupeds, to suit the purpose of his feeding, so that its form would have been lengthened out, and pointed towards the nostrils, and his lips would have projected from his mouth, lumpy and stiff and thick, fitted for taking up the grass, and his tongue would have either lain between his teeth, of a kind to match his lips, fleshy and hard and rough, assisting his teeth to deal with what came under his grinder, or it would have been moist and hanging out at the side like that of dogs and other carnivorous beasts, projecting through the gaps in his jagged row of teeth. If, then, our body had no hands, how could articulate sound have been implanted in it, seeing that the form of the parts of the mouth would not have had the configuration proper for the use of speech, so that man must of necessity have either bleated, or bayed, or barked, or neighed, or bellowed like an oxen or asses, or uttered some bestial sound. But now, as the hand is made part of the body, the mouth is at leisure for the service of the reason. Thus the hands are shown to be the property of the rational nature, the Creator having thus devised by their means a special advantage for reason. Chapter 9. That the form of man was framed to serve as an instrument for the use of reason. Now since our Maker has bestowed upon our formation a certain godlike grace, by implanting in his image the likeness of his own excellences, for this reason he gave of his bounty his other good gifts to human nature. But mind and reason we cannot strictly say that he gave, but that he imparted them, adding to the image the proper adornment of his own nature. Now, since the mind is a thing intelligible and incorporeal, its grace would have been incommunicable and isolated if its motion were not manifested by some contrivance. For this cause there is still need of this instrumental organization, that it might, like a plectrum, touch the vocal organs and indicate, by the quality of the note struck, the motion within. And as some skilled musician, who may have been deprived by some affection of his own voice, and yet wished to make his skill known, might make melody with voices of others, and publish his art by the aid of flutes or of the lyre, so also the human mind, being a discoverer of all sorts of conceptions, seeing that it is unable by the mere soul to reveal to those who hear by bodily senses the motions of its understanding, touches like some skillful composer these animated instruments, and makes known its hidden thoughts by means of the sound produced upon them. Now the music of the human instrument is a sort of compound of flute and lyre, sounding together in combination as in a concerted piece of music. For the breath, as it is forced up from the air-receiving vessels through the windpipe, when the speaker's impulse to utterance attunes the harmony to sound, and as it strikes against the eternal protuberances which divide the flute-like passage in a circular arrangement, imitates in a way the sound uttered through a flute, being driven round and round by the membranous projections. But the palate receives the sound from below in its own concavity, and dividing the sound by the two passages that extend to the nostrils, and by the cartilages about the perforated bone, as it were by some scaly protuberance, makes its resonance louder, while the cheek, the tongue, the mechanism of the pharynx, by which the chin is relaxed, when drawn in and tightened, when extended to a point, all these in many different ways answer to the motion of the plectrum upon the strings, varying very quickly as occasion requires the arrangement of the tones, and the opening and closing of the lips has the same effect as players produce when they check the breath of the flute with their fingers according to the measure of the tune. Chapter 10. That the mind works by means of the senses. As the mind then produces the music of reason by means of our instrumental construction, we are born rational, well as I think we should not have had the gift of reason if we had had to employ our lips to supply the need of the body, the heavy and toilsome part of the task of providing food. As things are, however, our hands appropriate this ministration to themselves, and leave the mouth available for the service of reason. The operation of the instrument, however, is twofold, one for the production of sound, the other for the reception of concepts from without, and the one faculty does not blend with the other, but abides in the operation for which it was appointed by nature, not interfering with its neighbor, either by the sense of hearing undertaking to speak, or by the speech undertaking to hear, For as the latter is always uttering something, while the ear, as Solomon somewhere says, is not filled with continual hearing. That point, as to our internal faculties, which seems to me to be even in a special degree matter for wonder, is this: what is the extent of that inner receptacle into which flows everything that is poured in by our hearing? Who are the recorders of the sayings that are brought in by it? What sort of storehouses are there for the concepts that are being put in by our hearing? And how is it that when many of them of varied kinds are pressing one upon another, there arises no confusion and error in the relative position of the things that are laid up there? And one may have the like feeling of wonder also with regard to the operation of sight. For by it also, in like manner, the mind apprehends those things which are external to the body, and draws to itself the images of phenomena, marking in itself the impressions of the things which are seen. And just as if there were some extensive city receiving all comers by different entrances, all will not congregate at any particular place, but some will go to the market, some to the houses, others to the churches, or the streets, or lanes, or the theaters, each according to his own inclination. Some such city of our mind I seem to discern established in us, which the different entrances through the senses keep filling, while the mind, distinguishing and examining each of the things that enters, ranks them in their proper departments of knowledge. And as, to follow the illustration of the city, it may often be that those who are of the same family and kindred do not enter by the same gate, coming in by different entrances, as it may happen, but are none the less, when they come within the circuit of the wall, brought together again, being on close terms with each other. And one may find the contrary happen, for those who are strangers and mutually unknown often take one entrance to the city, yet their community of entrance does not bind them together. For even when they are within, they can be separated to join their own kindred. Something of the same kind I seem to discern in the spacious territory of our mind. For often the knowledge which we gather from the different organs of sense is one, as the same object is divided into several parts in relation to the senses. And again, on the contrary, we may learn from some one sense many and varied things which have no affinity one with another. For instance, for it is better to make our argument clear by illustration, let us suppose that we are making some inquiry into the property of tastes, what is sweet to the sense and what is to be avoided by tasters. We find then by experience both the bitterness of gall and the pleasant character of the quality of honey. But when these facts are known, the knowledge is one which is given to us, the same thing being introduced to our understanding in several ways, by taste, smell, hearing, and often by touch and sight. For when one sees honey and hears its name, and receives it by taste, and recognizes its odor by smell, and tests it by touch, he recognizes the same thing by means of each of his senses. On the other hand, we get varied and multiform information by some one sense, for as hearing receives all sorts of sounds, and our visual perception exercises its operation by beholding things of different kinds, for it lights alike on black and white, and all things that are distinguished by contrariety of color. So with taste, with smell, with perception by touch, each implants in us by means of its own perceptive power the knowledge of things of every kind. Chapter 11. That the nature of mind is invisible. What then is, in its own nature, this mind that distributes itself into faculties of sensation, and duly receives by means of each the knowledge of things? That it is something else besides the senses, I suppose no reasonable man doubts. For if it were identical with sense, it would reduce the proper character of the operations carried on by sense to one, on the grounds that it is itself simple, and that in what is simple no diversity is to be found. Now, however, all agree that touch is one thing and smell another, and as the rest of the senses are in like manner so situated with regard to each other as to exclude intercommunion or mixture, we must surely suppose, since the mind is duly present in each case, that it is something else besides the sensitive nature, so that no variation may attach to a thing intelligible. Who hath known the mind of the Lord? The apostle asks, and I ask further, who has understood his own mind? Let those tell us who consider the nature of God to be within their comprehension, whether they understand themselves, if they know the nature of their own mind. It is manifold and much compounded. How then can that which is intelligible be composite? Or what is the mode of mixture of things of different kind? Or, it is simple and incomposite. How then is it dispersed into the manifold divisions of the senses? How is there diversity in unity? How is unity maintained in diversity? But I find the solution of these difficulties by recourse to the very utterance of God. For he says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." The image is properly an image, so long as it fails in none of these attributes which we perceive in the archetype. But where it falls from its resemblance to the prototype, it ceases in that respect to be an image. Therefore, since one of the attributes we contemplate in the divine nature is incomprehensibility of essence, it is clearly necessary that in this point the image should be able to show its imitation of the archetype. For if, while the archetype transcends comprehension, the nature of the image were comprehended, the contrary character of the attributes we behold in them would prove the defect of the image. But since the nature of our mind, which is the likeness of the Creator, evades our knowledge, it has an accurate resemblance to the superior nature, figuring by its own unknowableness the incomprehensible nature.